Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kelly Harris, and I am joined by Laura Schewel, the founder and CEO of Streetlight Data. Laura, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So what we'll be talking about today, this webinar is part of BrightTALK's Founder Spotlight series, where each week we interview a founder of a different company in a different industry. So today we'll be speaking with Laura about her experience founding Streetlight Data, what the company does, trends that she's seeing in the industry, and then advice and tips and best practices from other founders and entrepreneurs. So before we go ahead and get started, just a little bit about myself. I am a Senior Global Content Strategy Manager here at BrightTALK. I manage our IT infrastructure community, focusing specifically on cloud computing, data centers, storage, virtualization, network infrastructure, and DevOps. I graduated from Long Beach State here in California, and you can tweet at me at KellyHCommunity if you want to be involved in the series, if you have any questions for us, or use the hashtag #FoundersSpotlight. And also just a friendly reminder for people to send their written questions through the questions tab on the screen if you do have any questions for Laura throughout the webinar. So if you do want to get involved in this series, feel free to tweet at us, use the hashtag. Also make sure to check out the attachments section for links to other upcoming episodes in the series. And then any feedback and ratings you have for us, feel free to send those through the ratings box as well. Great, so we'll go ahead and dive in. So Laura, I would love to hear just a little bit more background on Streetlight Data, what you guys do, who you are, and the company's mission and what you're doing in the industry.
Sure. So Streetlight Data, we are a data and software company mixed together. So we're the first and only company in our industry to mix together the explosion of data coming off of mobile devices with software to make that data useful for the transportation industry. So what does that mean? So we do deals with different app companies, with different connected car, connected truck companies to collect anonymized data from mobile devices. That data describes how those devices and the people inside or attached to those devices are moving around. So we analyze all that data in aggregate. We enrich it by mixing in other data about demographics or data that says this is a highway and this is the ocean and this is the bridge, and turn that data into descriptions and metrics about how the transportation system is working, how people are moving through it. And what we sell is a software platform that allows our clients, who are transportation agencies, engineering firms, private transportation companies, they can log in and ask that data questions. So you can look up a transportation behavior at a specific place, a specific intersection, a specific town, anywhere in the US and Canada, going back several years, as easily as you would look up a fact in Wikipedia. So for example, if you were planning a new bus route, say across the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, you would want to know where the bus stop should be. And it's pretty clear there's traffic on the Bay Bridge. But you might say, okay, in order to get the most people the most conveniently into this bus, where should I pick them up on the East Bay side and drop them off on the San Francisco side? So with Streetlight, in just a few clicks, you can light up the Bay Bridge and say, hey, for the morning rush, show me the neighborhoods where the most people originate and the most people are going on a typical, Tuesday morning rush hour. And by using that map, you can have much more focused and efficient and effective transportation planning.
That's fascinating. I've never heard of anything like that before. So it's basically, so it's a way to really just kind of map out the best routes and be more efficient, as well as, I imagine, maybe kind of alleviate some of the congestion and traffic in some of these areas.
So the focus is it's not really a product for consumers. So it's not a product that would say, hey, to get to work by 8:30, you should take this route. It's a product that's for planners. So we're working on decisions that have a lead time. So it's not, hey, what am I going to do today? But hey, what should we do for the next 5 years? And the decisions are usually around infrastructure, so big investments. So infrastructure could be something huge, like a $4 billion highway extension. They can be something medium, like a new bus route, or they can be something small, like should the stoplight go on this corner or that corner? But we're always working on the system, the infrastructure, the things around you, and then we hope that that makes it, for the individual, a better transportation experience, though we're not influencing their decisions in a direct way. We're influencing the system in which they can make decisions.
Got it. Okay. That's great. And so moving on then, I've noticed there's been a lot of great press and publicity around the company lately. So tell us a little bit more about, what your mission is, what motivated you to start the company, and really how did you build the team from the ground up?
Good questions. So we have a great marketing team in addition to great product, which is why we're getting a lot of good press. And we've had some real strong success with clients the last few years. So I'm glad to see that paying off in the sort of more public sphere. So the mission of the company is to reduce vehicle miles traveled in personally occupied gasoline vehicles, which is a very precise way of saying we want less people driving by themselves in gas cars. And we want more people having as much transportation in their lives, but driving in non-gasoline powered vehicles, and preferably in shared vehicles like buses or shuttles or subways or bicycles. And so the way we want to achieve that mission is by changing the infrastructure for transportation. It's sort of a if you build it, they will come mentality. In the 50s, as the U.S. built out huge highway systems and built these massive arterial roads, and it became available to drive on those roads and easy and cheap to drive on those roads, driving shot up. And the environmental consequences are enormous. Transportation is over a third of our climate change-related emissions. And I think the social costs were very high in terms of people being away from each other, away from their families, not having this sort of shared space of transit in which to encounter your neighbors, not to mention the health benefits of everybody just driving and sitting all day. So I started the company 5 years ago with a smaller mission. So I had been working for a few years at a think tank called Rocky Mountain Institute, which is in Colorado, working on electric vehicle deployment and planning for electric vehicles. And this was back in 2006, where the new wave of electric vehicles was really getting big. So the Leaf was just coming out and the Tesla was just coming out, and we were getting ready for the second wave of new vehicles. And I worked with a lot of different types of companies. And what became really clear was everybody was asking this question that said, okay, hey, get some data and then let's model how these electric vehicles might, say, hit the electrical grid, or how they might show up and want to charge in grocery store parking lots. And there wasn't much data there. Then I went to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in D.C. To work on the same question, which is electric vehicle adoption from the perspective of the grid. And they really wanted detailed models that said, assuming certain things about electric vehicle adoption, where will they need to charge it? How much electricity will they need? And you need detailed data to do that. And the data just wasn't there. And I kept on looking and looking, and it wasn't there. So I identified that as a gap for electric vehicle infrastructure planning. And when I went back to grad school at UC Berkeley in the Energy and Resources group, I thought, hey, maybe this is research worthy. And that was around the time when iPhones and Androids had started the backgrounding feature, which means they could run two apps simultaneously, not just the app that was in the foreground. And I thought, hey, all these phones are there. People are carrying them around. They have GPS. Maybe I can develop an app that, collects data, and that could be a feed for some of these electric vehicle big picture questions. So that was the first nugget of insight. And I started working on that very narrow version of what Streetlight Data became. So I was in grad school, happily PhDing away, and I think everyone in the U.S. probably knows about in 2009 and 8, there was a very major financial crisis for the state of California. And the UC Berkeley is a state-funded school, and there was general financial crisis, and there was a lot of anxiety about funding for the UC system. And I was on a National Science Foundation GFRP Graduate Research Fellowship. There was even anxiety for a while that NSF funding would go away. So all the grad students were freaking out, and all the professors and administrators were freaking out about money. And my department has a lot of different types of researchers. And they said, hey, if you're an applied researcher, we think you have more funding options right now. So y'all go out and get creative about raising funds for, ancillary stuff, so we can save some of our block grants for the theoretical researchers or the, early science researchers that we're afraid their funding is more likely to get cut. And since I was researching something very applied and very topical, electric vehicle and data, I decided I could go out and find some creative money to fund my lab instead of using the departmental money. So I entered a business plan competition at the business school, Haas at UC Berkeley, just sort of turning my research idea into a business plan just for the cash. I had no intention of starting a business whatsoever, no interest in starting a business at all. So I won that business competition and got, I think, $40,000, $50,000 for the lab, which was great. I was very pleased. But when I did that, some people started talking to me, some investors who had been the judges, and saying, hey, this is not a bad idea. This is actually a pretty powerful idea. And do you really want to start this business? And hey, we should come have meetings. And I'd first laughed them off, but I had been thinking a lot about climate change and the frustration of working on climate change in an academic environment where all you get to do is write papers and then worry that no one reads them. So I thought, I don't know, I'll take some of these meetings. And as I started talking to them and looking more into the way I could have an environmental impact on transportation, it seemed clear that it was worth a shot to try for, a summer when I wasn't in classes to make a tech startup because, I was in the Bay Area and that's what you do and it sounded like fun. And if it did work, I could have more of an impact than this academic life. So that was really how it started.
That's great. That's fantastic. And, I know that there's, obviously a big vehicles efficiency, especially in transportation and some of these other industries. That being said, it does seem like somewhat of a niche industry in regards to transportation infrastructure. So how do you foresee that playing out in the future? Do you think there will be an increasing need for, companies to leverage the analytics and the amount of data that we now have the capacity to achieve and analyze? And how do you see that, kind of playing out for Streetlight Data moving forward?
So it became very clear after my first year and a half of trying this business that there is not a market for electrical vehicle infrastructure planning. So one of the best meetings I ever had, there was two great moments for us in changing this from a very specific electric vehicle idea to this is actually a real business that has legs because all of transportation needs this idea. So the first was as we were looking for data and as we were trying to talk to them, we spent a year talking to people about just electric vehicles. We talked to the car makers, we talked to the new EV charging companies, all that stuff. And what we saw was that everybody said it seemed really cool and then no one would pay us, which is not a good sign if you're starting a business. And so we said, okay, we started talking, I think the first conversation we had was about gas station planning and like repair facility planning, which is a form of transportation infrastructure because you want them distributed well. And once it sort of opened our minds up that actually this data was critical for planning all kinds of things, I just happened to know about electric vehicles, then we realized, there's actually an enormous market and there's a ton of people who want to pay us. And that's when we could see a business model that actually had legs. It took listening to some clients who were saying things we didn't expect to hear. And the other critical moment was one of our early VC rejections. So in the initial business model, we said, hey, we'll make our own app, and we'd spend all this time and money programming an app that collected data in the background about mobility, and we'll have some users, and we'll get everybody to use the app, and then once we have millions and millions and millions of people, then we'll have this amazing business that can sell data to all these different types of things. And one VC said, and this was very smart, even though it annoyed me at the time, no, we're not going to invest in you because you have two businesses. One business is trying to get people to use your app, and then the other business is monetizing the data from that app in this powerful transportation planning kind of way. And no startup succeeds that's really two businesses. You can only have one. And then even then it's hard enough. And he was right. So eventually what we realized is that so many different apps and so many different connected vehicle companies collect data for their own purposes that it is silly to try to make your own app because, you're competing with Candy Crush and no one's going to win against Candy Crush or Boggle or whatever the app is. So instead, we partnered with all these different companies that already immediately gave us access to millions of devices. And right now we're analyzing over 70 million devices every day. We could have never gotten that kind of data trying to make our own app. So those were the two key moments where we shifted our business model from this overly niche electric vehicle thing with our own app to this actually incredibly powerful business model of taking advantage of data exhaust coming off thousands of other people's needs, projects, businesses, and harnessing that for a generalized transportation infrastructure software. And I got paid. Electric vehicles have always been a passion of mine. It's been 5.5 years. In November, I got my first paying electric vehicle charging infrastructure planning project. So 5 years in. So if we had not expanded our focus, we would have gone out of business a long time ago. And I was very excited when we finally got paid to do something with electric vehicle charging.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Congratulations. So going off of that then, would you say, you know, obviously there's a ton of big data companies out there now, especially in regards to, you know, IoT and connected devices as that market continues to expand. So what would you say is the main differentiator between Streetlight Data and some of these other big data analytics companies that are out there?
Yeah, great question. So there's a few different things going on in the market. So one thing is we actually make money. You know, we do millions of dollars in revenue. We have hundreds of clients. And a lot of the other companies out there, including the IoT big data groups started by some of these massive tech companies, do not make revenue yet. And so I really believe in startups. I know, because I talk to a lot of founders or potential founders or people who are thinking about founding. If your business if no one is paying for your product, you have a problem. And I hear people talk about things like, oh, well, you know, we've done user testing and the feedback is extremely positive. And, you know, oh, we're just trying to build up audience and then we'll figure out monetization. If you're not getting paid, you don't have a business. So we developed a product that answers a direct and clear need for the transportation community by listening to the community and understanding exactly what data they needed. So they will buy. So that's one of the key differences, is that we are not a platform for big data. Most of the other IoT products are a generalized platform. We are a very targeted use case. So if you drew a pyramid of the market, we'd be at the point of the pyramid as opposed to halfway down. So that's a big differentiation. And then the other difference is that a lot of those tools are old-fashioned business models in that they still need hardware, and that hardware needs to be manufactured, needs to be installed, needs to be maintained, and maintenance for hardware that gets run over by cars all day long is a really big deal, and has to be upgraded. And that is a really hard business model to scale. And so I think that one of the other reasons we're out competing a lot of those other world of new IoT companies is because our data is ready to go in seconds. We can do a demo immediately, and the cost and the installation and maintenance cycle for some of these other things just makes it really hard to get off the ground.
Totally. That's great. So one other question before we move on. In terms of the future of transportation, it is an industry that's changing rapidly due to these technologies and the access that we have to so much data. What makes you the most excited about the future of transportation, and what doesn't? What seems really daunting to you as someone who's in the industry day in and day out?
So to me, my biggest anxiety is around climate change, and that we aren't making the changes we need to reduce emissions coming from transportation, both in the United States as well as in the developing world, where the acceleration of personal automobile ownership is quite scary. It's scary. The climate cannot sustain it, which doesn't mean it's fair that we got to have our personal cars for a while and other countries don't, but nevertheless, the climate can't sustain it. And I think that we've been seeing huge leap forward. So what makes me happy is we are seeing some real significant changes. You know, when I started this, everybody said transportation was not a market that mattered. It would never change. And frankly, Uber, despite some of its more recent bashes in the media and missteps, Uber opened up the world of investment and opened up everyone's eyes that there could be massive disruption in transportation. So now, smart cities, GovTech, everything you want to say like that is a market that people know about. And when I started 5.5 years ago, it absolutely was not. So I'm excited that people are seeing that change is possible. I'm not excited in the way that some of the most hyped and funded change is going. So autonomy and autonomous vehicles are occupying a huge portion of airwaves and investment money. And I think autonomy could be very good from a climate perspective, and definitely will be good from a reducing of car crash fatalities perspective. But I think it has a lot of potential dangers as well. First of all, there's no guarantee that it will be electric or that the electric it uses in different parts of the world will be clean. Second, I think it has the potential to increase sprawl because the effective cost of driving goes down if you can take a nap or do work while you're in the vehicle. And I think it has the potential for increasing social isolation. And I think that's hugely dangerous to our civil society. So I have anxiety about climate, anxiety about the excitement around autonomy, making it hard for us to deploy it in a powerful way that makes our society better for all. And I also think that this American trend of divergence in income, we see transportation exacerbates it because transportation is a high percentage of the cost of living if you're a low-income person. And what that means is that if you can't get to your job because your car is broken down and then you lose your job, you can get into this really negative cycle. Or if you're priced out of living near your job and have to live an hour and a half away because of traffic, then the cost of just having you can spend as much money getting to work and parking and driving home as you make at your job. And we actually see that happening in San Francisco, wages wiped out by transportation and parking costs for employees. And if we don't harness the power of these new transportation things, the ride sharing, the ride hailing, the bike sharing, the autonomy, to fix that problem, then we haven't really made advances. We're just playing with toys. So that's what gives me anxiety, is that we get so excited about the upside of these technologies that we don't harness their power to fix some of the extremely real problems we have with transportation equity and with climate change.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great point. And for the audience who's listening in, is Streetlight Data focusing currently just on the Bay Area region, or is it statewide, is it nationwide, and where do you see it growing and expanding?
We cover the U.S. and Canada, everywhere. We are going to be expanding to Mexico soon and some European countries thereafter. And one of the things, because I think we're talking about being a founder, not just transportation on this, the concerns I brought up about climate change and equity, one of the really hard things as a founder is my most important job is to keep my business alive and to keep cash in the bank. And we work on projects that I think are interesting and helpful, but aren't necessarily in line with my mission. You know, they aren't super opposed to it, but, you know, we work a lot on highway expansion and off-ramps and things that are not what I thought I'd be working on when I started my life as a transportation sustainability person. And as a founder, you have to come up with a set of rules for yourself to say, you have to basically balance needs of the business with your own personal needs and put the business ahead of yourself. And that's been a really interesting internal conversation for me, to learn what I've gotten comfortable with and to know that doing some of these jobs that are sort of neutral earns you the right to do some of the really extraordinary boundary pushing projects. And I think that for anyone who's interested in creating a startup for a not simply financial outcome, that's a conversation you're going to start having a lot earlier with yourself than you think.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And going off of that, we did get a question from the audience, and their question is, what advice do you have for other founders or entrepreneurs that are wanting to start a company and secure investment in a similar niche industry, you know, something that isn't talked about every day, and, you know, finding the gap in that market and being able to build a company from it?
Yeah, so it's a lot easier to start the company than to secure investors. So we had a rough experience getting investment the first time around before transportation was cool. And we were perceived as an extreme niche. And I did a few things I don't think were the right call. So I'll tell you about those mistakes I made and then give some more answers to the questions. So the first thing I did was I was in San Francisco, so I pitched the Sand Hill Road classic suite of investors. And I think if you're in a niche industry that is not hot in Silicon Valley, that is a mistake. They are very trend oriented. So and if you go to investors who are basically, it's about targeting your investors if you're in a niche industry. It's always about targeting your investors, but even more if you're in a niche industry. So you want to use tools like, Crunchbase and search for companies, other startups that are in your industry and see who financed them. Not necessarily competitors, because sometimes investors won't fund competitors for good reason, but look either for investors who have funded kind of in your industry or have funded industries like you. So for example, I consider funding startups that sell products to utilities to be similar to funding startups that sell products to government, just as an example of adjacent markets. So you need to look very, very carefully and not just go for the big names, because if you're in a niche market, it also means your investment world is niche. The next thing I would tell you to do is look for a relatively new trend called strategic venture capital. So lots and lots of the really big companies, especially the non-American ones, have opened up venture capital branches in the United States that focus on investment that's sort of adjacent to them. So if you have a niche chip, computer chip technology, I don't even know if that's niche, I bet you that some of the big chip companies have venture arms. So go to the strategics, because the benefit is that they already kind of get your market and are focused on your market. So think about who is in your niche, and it's huge. And sometimes even if they don't have an official venture capital arm, they might invest in you. The third advice I would have is a good way to take advantage and get to the top of the pile in investing is not to be in Silicon Valley. It is to be in another place, because there are investment communities that are focused on local VC investment. They are in the Northwest, the Midwest, the South. So if you happen not to be in Silicon Valley, look for local money, because their niche is you, because you are in their community and creating jobs in their community. And then the last thing I would do is, once you do pitch an investor, just have a really good market explanation and send it to them in advance.
Awesome. That is fantastic advice. It looks like we got another question from the audience that says, how do you grow and scale a team in a smart and cost-efficient way, balancing demand with budget?
At the beginning, we were just a few people, and none of us took a salary. And what that means is that you have to be financially secure enough that that is not a decision that's going to ruin your life if things don't work out. So I think people should think really hard about that. And I was lucky enough to be in a position where, because of my NSF funding, I was in that safe space for, a year or so. And I just want to acknowledge that creates a real lack of diversity in the entrepreneur community, because you have to have a certain level of economic security to take those risks. And that's just part of how this industry has worked, which is really frustrating. So you need to have people who can truly work for free without destroying their lives, is the first answer for the first phase. The next is you need to be generous with stock for the next round of employees who are getting paid, but are getting paid below market, because we're all working at an early stage company. So I just saw the most amazing fights between founders and early employees about stock percentages. And it is so putting the cart before the horse. Because first of all, your stock is effectively worth nothing for years. So if you don't keep on moving forward, it won't be worth anything. So you should just be generous. And if you want people to work that hard for you, you need to be generous and not hoard it just because you're the founder. And the other thing I would remind people is that when you get big financing, like Series A, Series B, Series C, the pie, people readjust stock. So there's always room to change. So be generous with your stock. That's very important. And then third is you need to pick people not for just because they're experienced. And this is a mistake I also made. Someone who's been around the block 10 times might be tired of going around the block. So you need to find that magical person who is experienced enough not to be clueless. And our team is a little older than average for a tech startup, and I think that's part of our success, because people had been trained in how to work and had all worked at startups before. But at the same time, you don't want someone who's really on a victory lap. You want someone who's going to work extremely hard. So that's a sort of a magical middle you have to find to be cost efficient, because people have to. You need a person who has the capacity to work 8 hours a day and do what someone else could do in 12 or 16 or 20 hours a day.
Right. So it's kind of like the Goldilocks effect. Yeah. Awesome. That is very helpful. Great. So we'll go ahead and dive into just a little bit more about your background. I know you've covered a bit of this already, but would love to hear a little bit more of just your professional background in education and, you know, a little bit more about how you got to where you are today and really what made you passionate about this industry enough to start a company.
Sure. So my background was in sustainable transportation. I had no intention of starting a tech startup. I had never worked at a for-profit company before Streetlight Data. I had worked at a nonprofit and I'd worked for the government. And I had never even had an internship at a for-profit company. I'd worked at like other nonprofits. So really I was not into startups when I started this at all. And I frankly think that's been a huge benefit. I think if people go looking if they just want to start something and are looking for an idea, that's usually a recipe for something that doesn't work out. Passion for the industry and for the product and for the customers is really what it takes to make something that can scale and just doesn't fall into, you know, being a derivative type product. So I really did know transportation, and I had done a lot of work as an academic. I had gotten a lot of recognition, and I'd done a lot of work as a nonprofit and a government person. So I knew what I was talking about when it came to transportation, and my passion and interest and knowledge of that read very clearly to investors. And the other thing I would say about pitching investors is don't pretend that you have more experience that you have. You know, if you have never been a startup founder or worked at a startup but like did a 3-month internship, no one's going to take that seriously. So be who you are. And I think, you know, when I talk about myself, I say very clearly, this is what I've done. I never had worked at a startup. I had never even worked at a for-profit company before this, but I really know this market. I know what this market needs in the product. And that honesty is far more compelling than saying, if I took, you know, one class in a business school about clean tech to market, which I did, they're not going to buy that. So the passion really came out of being exposed to the transportation data gap, as I said, and also there's so much wrong with the climate, and transportation is just as wrong as a lot of other things, but I think transportation gets less attention, and certainly did when I started getting into this field 10 years ago. Solar power and wind power and recycling all get a lot more research and a lot more sort of, I think, mind share. And so transportation seemed a thing that was important enough because it can destroy the world if we do it wrong, and was just drastically understudied and undermeasured. And so when you're sort of looking at the climate change crisis, or as I was looking at the climate change crisis and feeling overwhelmed, you just kind of have to choose something that's interesting to focus on because everything is worth focusing on. And transportation is big enough that I got attracted to it. And also, transportation is interesting. I mean, it's interesting to think about why people go to the grocery store 4 times a week because they can't be bothered to remember what they actually need and then, you know, rack up all these extra miles. It's interesting to think about what it means that if a low-income person is 10 minutes late for work, they can get fired, but if someone like me is 10 minutes late for work, it's fine. I just get on the phone as I'm walking in. Those sorts of ways that transportation interacts with social issues, with quality of life, with technology, it was a good choice from a climate change perspective, and it's been a fascinating choice from a things you study every day perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting in that in our society we're rewarded for racking up those miles and spending the money on gas. You know, we get the rewards, we get the points, we get the cash back. So, you know, it's almost like it's counterintuitive in that, you know, really our society wants us to go to the grocery store 4 times a week, and you know, and use those resources as much as possible. So what, you know, how do you, in terms of, you know, you talk about mind share and those sorts of things. I mean, do you see it being a shift in mindset that we need in society in addition to the technology?
So this is not, I think, the answer that everybody wants to hear, but in my academic life, after studying the way that people react to prods, you know, ask them to take the bus because of the climate impact or to try to, you know, organize their life to only go shopping 1 day a week, I just don't think that works. I don't think that prodding individuals is an effective, or I don't think that waiting and asking for mindset is an effective systemic change. So, I mean, sure, we need it, but I just don't think we're going to get it. I think the countermeasures of convenience, of stress, of busyness are just too strong. And so that's one of the reasons I focus Streetlight on infrastructure. I think that if you can get infrastructure right, you will change every decision made in that city for 30 years. And that is far more effective than trying to create a mindset shift that is going against the face of these massive market forces like the ones you described. So sure, we need it. I don't think we're going to get it. I think instead we have to make taking transit or switching to electric car or riding your bike share the more convenient, easier, and cheaper cost and safer choice. I don't think people will make a sacrifice for those outcomes.
Right. I agree. Great. So we have just a couple last questions here. In regards to, some of what we were just discussing, what would you say is the number one challenge that you face today as the founder of this company?
Let's see. So right now, as the founder, my biggest challenge is to balance how busy we are with our sort of month-to-month goals, what we're selling right now and getting all of our proposals in and hiring all these new people. All these things are very time-consuming and very fun and exciting. But as a founder, I also have to be thinking about the big picture stuff, not just the 6-month plan or the 12-month plan, but the 36-month plan. And finding the time to balance the fact that we're still small. We're about 40 people. I'm still very involved in day-to-day operations, with transitioning to when the CEO and founder becomes someone who is still involved in daily operations, but is doing more long-term strategic thinking. We're at a transition phase for that in terms of the scale of the company right now, and it's just a matter of balancing my time and attention. So that's one of the biggest challenges I face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And, as a follow-up to that, I think it's interesting that, people that are founding and starting companies, if that wasn't ever one of your goals really, or if that wasn't necessarily what started you on this path, it turned into, where you ended up now. How do you really prepare yourself? Are you taking, entrepreneurship courses? Are you, taking management courses? I mean, if somebody who wants to found a company doesn't have any experience, leading organizations or teams, where might you suggest that they start in order to make sure that they're successful not only at starting the company, but also leading this team and leading their people?
It's a good question. So I don't have a great opinion of a lot of the courses that are out there that are like learn how to be an entrepreneur, et cetera. I think that there's basically everyone is making it up is something I've learned. So no one really knows what they're doing. So you don't have to feel bad if you don't really know what you're doing. If you care enough about it and are just a reasonably smart person, that's just as good, if not better, than most of the people out there. So don't worry too much about taking every course or being perfectly prepared. There are some things I do think that are critical. One is you need experience in managing something, right? And it could have been a lab at your graduate program, or in my case, it was managing a department, a team at my nonprofit. But if you don't have experience managing anything, you should probably get a job that gives you that as preparation. Two is you need a good mentor who's been through it before, who's willing to put in real time for you. And three, you do need to learn the basics. And I would call the 10 to 12 slide investor deck. That's one of the basics that you need to learn to master. Just very concrete, direct communication skills. And after those things, it a little bit depends on you. I see people, and frankly, sometimes they're investors, but more often are the associates at the venture capital firms. They quote these business books and these sort of structures that these business books or startup founder books have made as gospel, and I just don't think they are gospel. I think startups are different from each other, especially if you're doing a startup in a niche market, which is something that Streetlight has done. you should take it as like, oh, that's interesting, but it's not gospel. So in terms of preparation, those are the 4 things. Get a job managing something, learn how to make a great deck, get a mentor, and those are the most important things you could do.
Great. Yeah, I agree, and I think those are very succinct, actionable takeaways that people can utilize, so that's great to hear. Great, and one last question that I had.
I had one more. You have to learn how to take rejection. You get rejected so much, especially at the beginning. And I see all these entrepreneurs who get mad. They're like, well, these people just didn't understand me. And I'm like, no, you didn't make yourself understood, and you should listen to what they didn't understand. And a lot of people who flame out because they can't handle the rejection.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a good one to add. Awesome. And then on this slide here, my last question for you is just what is the future of Streetlight Data? What's next for you guys? What are some of the next big projects that you're focusing on in the near future?
That's a great question. So thus far, our product has been really built for, a group of professionals who are fairly technical transportation planners, transportation market planners, et cetera, from engineering firms, transportation agencies, and private transportation companies. The next version of the product is really about putting the big data to work for either less technical people or for newer things. So we're building a suite of tools that's about data storytelling. And the data storytelling is basically to help tackle a problem in plain English. So maybe your problem is, I have $1 million, I need to invest in bike lanes. Where should I put them in my city? Where do I even get started? And it's using big data to walk people through that process. And so what that means is that we're bringing big data and big data for transportation first to audiences that are less technical, and we're also bringing it in earlier in the transportation planning process, and we're allowing it to be part of a conversation with more stakeholders. So it's trying to move sort of up the ladder in terms of how we influence the way critical decisions are made. That's a big focus for us this year. And that involves visualization, interactivity widgets, and all sorts of fun customer conversations to get that data storytelling flowing as often as possible.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Wonderful. So before we wrap up, if anybody has any last questions that they would like to submit through, please do so for Laura. We'll give you a few seconds here to send those in. Otherwise, in the meantime, Laura, are there any other last points or tips or best practices you want to provide the audience? You've already shared some really great ones for future founders.
Sure. So I think that at least 40% of my success, especially in the early days, is because I worked hard at being a good presenter and a good PowerPoint deck writer. And if you can't articulate in 5 slides what your business is and why it is going to make money and who's going to pay you that money, then you're not ready. And when I give feedback to people, they're like, well, you're not getting the essence, and it's more complicated than that. It's not allowed to be more complicated than that. You have to find a way to be excellent at presenting your idea in a very short amount of time. So work on your presentation skills, both the creating and the giving of the presentations, and get good at being rejected. I guess those are my wrap-up advices. Yeah,
that's great. I love those. Those are both very applicable probably for most folks. Great. Okay. Well, it looks like that's it for the questions today. So just a reminder to the audience, check out the attachment section for links to additional episodes in the Founder Spotlight series. Feel free to reach out to either myself or Laura if you have any other questions or want to take the conversation offline. Otherwise, Laura, I thank you very much for your time today. It was wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.